Welcome to Disaffected. I am Joshua Slocum, and this is the show where we talk about politics, culture, and relationships through a psychological lens. And this is our last show before Christmas. We're going to be taking a break next week, but we have got some good stuff for you this week. First, we're going to talk to marriage and family therapist Jake Wiskerchen once again. You may have seen him. He was on our show a couple months ago. We're going to talk about a couple of things. The slow burn type of cluster B personality disorder having person, or the person who may be sub-disorder but has a lot of traits, and how they can be harder to detect in your life, but how they can do a lot of very deep damage over time. And we're also going to have some listener mail from somebody who's dealing with a very difficult situation with a personality disorder person, and Jake is going to help us put that in context and maybe offer some advice for these people who've written in. And after that, we are going to talk about COVID bloodlust, because even though we're almost 2 years into this, people's hysteria seems to be only increasing, not decreasing. And boy, would these people like to see you locked down and silenced for the rest of your life. So all that's coming up. Come see us after the break. For more conversation on the dark and disordered psychology that shapes today's cultural and political left, subscribe to our weekly audio podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and virtually anywhere else you get your podcasts. Let's learn to recognize these dynamics and call them what they are. Subscribe to Disaffected to learn how to break the spell.
We now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us, and thank you.
So we are joined again by marriage and family therapist Jake Wiskerchen. And I wanted to bring Jake on for this episode so that we can talk about something that he brought up in a conversation we had, and I think it's important. The concept of the slow burn type of cluster B or abusive person. Somebody who may not be as obvious, dramatic, and demonstrative, but who can do a lot of non-obvious damage over time by flying under people's radar. So, Jake, welcome back. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate any opportunity I get to share this stuff with the public. My goal is to just disseminate information as accurately and ethically as possible so that other people can learn from it and not, be on their heels, if you will, and, help solve their own problems. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, and thank you. So let's talk about the slow burners. Let's talk about the people who are toxic or have toxic effects on people, but who somehow slip under the radar and aren't as easy to detect, maybe, as some of the others that I talk about on the show.
Yeah, I think the best way to conceptualize this is to think of people who you commonly refer to as, it's like, oh, that's just so-and-so doing what he does, or that's just Mike being Mike, or whatever it is. That's an indicator, right? But I want to be careful that for as much as we follow each other on Twitter and stuff, and as much as you promote the whole don't diagnose, it's okay to label things as they are and call them what they are, but we don't tread into diagnostic territory. I get that. Like, I really, really appreciate that. But I think where we get hung up sometimes is that these quote unquote slow burn, and I don't even know if that's an accurate term. I know I threw it out there one day, but the lower level cluster B personality disorder presentation may not rise to full diagnostic criteria, because when we think back to the definition of an actual mental disorder, like in the first few pages of the book, it says clinically significant distress or impairment in important areas of functioning. And some of those important areas of functioning are social, relational, occupational, legal, medical, because sometimes you can have some medical issues that go along with mental disorders. And that those words, clinically significant distress or impairment, really operate when we're trying to diagnose somebody. So you look at somebody who may have this like low lying or slow burning personality disorder, and there's no obvious impacts to significant distress or impairment in their important areas of functioning. But for the people who know them really, really well and for a really long period of time, they have a long view of the life that they've led, and they also have kind of a 10,000-foot view of their whole life. So in a clinical setting, it may be really hard for a clinician to detect this because they're getting snapshots as presented either by the individual or the individual's ex or spouse or whatever. But longitudinally, people who know him really, really well will say, yeah, he's always had a revolving door of jobs, or she's always had a revolving door of relationships, or man, they just can't seem to settle down. They're always bouncing around. But observationally, it's like finances are intact. They're paying their bills. They look successful, right? And these could be professional athletes. They could be professional people in different, careers. Or it's just, your crazy uncle who, never married and has always had, 7 careers or whatever. And I want to call attention to that because it's really confusing sometimes for the people who they touch when there's no obvious thing to point at. It's just kind of this general slow burning, I guess you could say, malaise or frustration with the individual. Like, I don't get why Uncle Tom constantly, has to make everything all about him. It's like, well, ding, ding, ding. Like your and I ears will gravitate to that like narcissistic effect. And it's like, yeah, all about them. But then you flip the coin and they're like, man, he always donates to charity. It's like, how do we reconcile this? Like, well, does he talk about donating to charity? Because that's all about him if he does, right? That's a virtue signal. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. And I've teed it up well enough, I think, and you can continue to ask questions, but I don't want to go on sermonizing people.
No, I mean, that's a good description. I think there's sort of a question buried in there. The question is, how do we define disorder? And I do understand the criterion that you're talking about, clinically significant distress or impairment. I think that I may have a disagreement with the consensus view on this. I may not. I'm sort of formulating this. I'm saying this out loud for the first time, so my mind might change. I don't think I agree with the idea that as long as a person does not subjectively perceive that they have a problem, that means we cannot diagnose them with having a problem. I understand the consensus view on that. I'm challenging that. So, for example, I believe I remember an article written within the past 4 years about Donald Trump by one of the men who was on the committee to define narcissistic personality disorder for the DSM. I think I'm remembering this correctly. And if I remember what he wrote correctly, he was quite insistent that somebody like Donald Trump could not have narcissistic personality disorder by definition, because Donald Trump does not subjectively perceive himself to be impaired, and we can see that he is successful.
Right. And
I find that astonishing.
Yeah.
It would be to me, I mean, how far do we go with that? Take an uncontroversial to us, an uncontroversial psychopath who spends his entire life serial killing and not being detected. He doesn't think there's anything wrong with him. He never faces any consequences because no one catches him.
Right.
Does that mean that he is not a psychopath because he doesn't feel that he is one? Or does it mean that he's not a psychopath because serial killing works for him?
Yeah, no, it's I wish I'd prepared and brought the book with me. It's I have several in the office, but I'd have to go get up and get them. But I don't want to misquote, but essentially the book doesn't say that. The book doesn't say that the person has to clear their throat and raise their hand and say, yes, I believe I'm suffering or struggling in order to achieve diagnostic criteria. There's a workaround whereby we can ascertain a diagnosis based on testimony from other individuals. So a classic example is substance abuse disorders. I don't have a problem. I could quit anytime I want, right? But you get 7 or 8 people who all come in, and this is why family systems work is so great, by the way, is because the lineage of the profession of family systems and family systemic thinkers through the marriage and family therapy world basically said, get as many people in the room as you can across generations to get as accurate of a picture as you can about what's going on in the family system, right? So if you get 7 or 8 people who maybe are related, maybe just work with the person or whatever, and they go, actually, man, you've shown up late to work because you're hungover for 7 of the last 9 shifts, or and then the guy's like, well, no, I always stay up late, right? And they're like, well, you stay up late drinking, right? And then eventually everybody's like, yeah, Dad, we noticed that you're really mean when you're not drinking, or you really mean when you are drinking. And so you get all this bigger picture of information that says, hey, man, I don't care what you have to say about yourself. We've got 7 or 8 other people all testifying that you meet criteria. You can't stop when you want to. You drink more than you intend to, like whatever the criteria are for substance use disorder.
Sure.
And then you kind of hand it to them and you go, what do you want to do with this? And I think that's where we're going with this conversation, where I'd prefer that people go with any mental illness conversation is, what next? Great. We have a diagnosis. Awesome. What next? Right. So it doesn't do any good if we just diagnose people and then don't do anything with it. Or even if I walk into the clinic myself and get a diagnosis,
right.
What we want to do is we want to formulate a treatment plan out of that. And that's where the real rub comes in. I think I shared this on the last one. It was like the old joke about how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? It's like 1, but the light bulb has to want to change.
Yeah.
You can have all the insight in the world, but if you're not interested in actually changing your patterns of behavior, your thinking, your response to environment, emotionally, whatever it is, nothing's going to happen. And that's where I think your real question is. And like a lot of the work you do, which is so great, is aimed at, hey, a lot of people just lack the insight. Doesn't matter how many people tell them no, doesn't matter how many jobs they get fired from, doesn't matter how many relationships that get terminated. They're just not going to change. And so what do you do then? Well, you set your own boundaries, you move on, whatever. And It's sad, and we can tolerate that. But that's the next question is, so what? So what next?
Okay, well, we can get to that question, but let's see if I guess I'm going to ask you to give another couple of maybe a composite example, maybe describing one of the typical ways that such a person who may meet criteria but who is otherwise successful, who stays in our lives for a long time. Give us a couple other examples of what that might look like. Bob or Jane, who fits these criteria. What might be a scenario that would be something that listeners could recognize?
Yeah. And I want to do this. I have no problem with that. I just want to do it with the caveat that when people are listening, they may go, oh, okay, cool. It totally makes sense now that Auntie so-and-so has borderline personality disorder on a low simmering level. She's not the raging BOW that, we often hear about, but she's just sort of high fluttering anxiety and kind of sort of causing chaos all over the place, but it's tolerable, right? And she's lovable and she's a good mom for all intent and purpose. But it's like, man, you just operate at a higher vibration than a lot of other people. Great. She's got borderline. Now what? Right. So pause on that, because that was my first invitation, okay. But it might look like somebody who's constantly making up what sound like logical reasons for changing careers yet again, or starting another graduate program, or going back to school for a different undergraduate. And it's like, you've done this like 10 or 11 times over the last 12 or 15 years. That would be an indicator. Something like constantly critiquing the kids, making them question what they're doing without actually pointing them in a direction, right? So they're just never really attaching, never really committing, always second guessing. And it's done out of a loving, compassionate point of view. Usually it sounds good to the untrained ear. You're like, I just want them to have as many experiences as possible. It's like, yeah, well, you're also teaching them not to commit. And I think that's a lot of times done out of the person's own shadow. They're projecting their own insecurities because they themselves can't commit to things because it's just too scary, or they don't have practice in, or whatever it is. And so therefore they're going to teach their kids the same avoidance. And at the heart of all this is just really it's insecurity. It's an inability to be intimate. It's an inability to be vulnerable. It's an inability to really, truly, deeply commit. And you go, well, this doesn't make sense. They've been married for 25 years, or they've been married for 15 years, or sometimes they haven't been married, but they've committed to a career, right? There's commitments in other areas of life that sort of run afoul of the traditional diagnostic criteria, which makes it so darn hard to navigate, especially for clinicians, but also the the loved ones around. So you're like, can't be borderline personality disorder because they've committed over here. It can't be narcissism because he always goes to church and donates to charity. It's like, it's not about that. It's about the constant rubber band fence. And for the viewing audience, you can see my fingers on the screen. If the listening audience, if you don't have the video, picture like put your hand in a cup formation with the fingers all sort of separated. Now imagine yourself putting a rubber band around all your fingers. So in the center is like, we'll call it just your heart, right? And then around that is a rubber band. And if somebody from the outside tries to get in real close, they hit the rubber band and it flexes a little bit. And it seems like you're getting close to the inside, but there's always the rubber band there. And there's always the opportunity for it to snap back and kick you out. I think the rubber band fence is a really good analogy for what a lot of these folks with the kind of the low level, slow burning cluster B personality disorders look like. It's like, man, I really want to get close to you, but you just won't let me. And it seems like I am sometimes, but then I get booted, as opposed to the highfalutin, bombastic cluster B personality disorders where they're obviously rejecting, pushing away, but then maybe reaching out and yanking you back in, right? That's the constant back and forth in the hot and cold. This one's a softer, more genteel version of it, but the effects are still the same, which is an erosion of intimacy.
So, well, that I think leads us naturally to your question. So if, what then? What would we say to people who find themselves in the situation and say, that sounds like my husband, or it sounds like my cousin or my mother or whoever it is? What should they be thinking about?
I always default to boundaries. Know your own boundaries very well. If you know your limits, your convictions, your ethics, your moral matrix, and you can apply that consistently and with compassion, but without emotion, right? You're emotionally non-attached to this stuff. You go, hey, I can't do another dinner with you guys because it always comes back to how you complain about work and you're refusing to do anything about it. And it's always someone else's fault. Like, that's just negative. And like, I just don't want to do it anymore. So you don't go to dinner with that couple anymore or whatever. Maybe you don't invite them over to the Christmas party because they're irritating, or maybe you do, but you do it on your terms, right? Because there's still value in the relationship. Maybe the kids enjoy hanging out with each other or whatever. If you're a professional and you're a boss and you're dealing with this in the workspace, somebody's just constantly always causing chaos. And it doesn't matter how many times you sit down with them, you might have to terminate them. And that's for the best of I should say, it's for the good of the whole company. There's always an excuse. Tire popped, battery wasn't charged, car out of gas. For some reason, it's always an automobile because it's like everybody can identify with how you can't get to work, missed the bus.
Right.
Like, yeah, but how many times are we going to allow this to happen before you make a decision in your life to eliminate the excuses, remove the barriers, and show up to work? We're all counting on you, right? And then you just set a boundary. You say, as much as I love you and I have compassion for your situation, I can't let you take down the company. So setting boundaries is good. Having compassion. We don't have to judge people. We can see that they can't get out of their own way. That's fine. But we move forward. At the end of the day, I protect myself, my family, my business, my associates. And, I don't have to have a mean spirit in my heart about it. I just say, no, it's a business decision. And we can make business decisions with our family members as well.
People have a really hard time with that, as you know, obviously, because you talk to these people every day. It brings to mind somebody I follow on social media who writes from the perspective of a spouse of somebody with borderline personality disorder. So he himself doesn't have it, but his wife does. And it's when he posts, he seems to vacillate between being pleased at what he thinks are signs of progress in terms of how she or other borderlines deal with emotional excess. He vacillates between that and really sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Really being frustrated and asking people for guidance and saying, is there a way I can manage this dynamic that happens with my wife? I've tried this, I've tried this, I've tried this, and I've tried it for years. So what I'm hearing or what I'm reading as an observer appears to me to be somebody who has been in a years long marriage. And I don't know this person very well, so I'm making deductions just based on what they choose to share in their life. But if that is an accurate representation, what I think is going on is this is a man who I don't think he's ready to accept that there may not be a way to manage his wife. She may not get to the place of consistent progress that he believes she could get to. And it appears that this is just a cycle that's gone on for years and years and years, because I don't understand how to help somebody or how to discuss with somebody who's been in a cycle like that with a borderline for years, literally, and continues to ask the same sorts of questions that I hear from people who are just waking up to their personality disordered person, right? It's almost like he hasn't moved past that initial shock. Now it's 10 years later and he's still asking how to manage the insanity. So I guess that's kind of a digression, but the place I wanted to get to was this brings us to the fact that boundaries very often with these people mean we're not going to be in contact anymore.
Yeah.
We're not going to be having dinner with each other. Maybe we're not going to be married.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes
people don't like to hear that.
Yeah. Sometimes it does lead to that. But then I also want to be mindful and compassionate for the people who that's not an option, right? We're just not going to put that on the table. Breakup isn't an option. And I want to be very, very cautious about when I say these things. It's hard to have a generalized conversation with you on a podcast with thousands of people listening, because all situations are unique and different. If the person's sitting in front of me on the couch, it's way easier because we can pinpoint with precision the instances where we could say, here's what you can do differently next time, because it will happen again, right? Almost exactly the same way. And you say, next time, think about doing this instead of the other thing, right? But when we speak in generalities, it's very, very challenging. So what I want to say is I choose not to give up hope if the other person hasn't given up hope, right? So the other thing I want to say is if there's violence, and we all have our own thresholds for violence, and I understand that, but if there's violence, I don't advocate for sticking it out. That's keep people safe first, fix problems later. And that's really how like the criminal justice system is supposed to work too. Like we incarcerate people and then we're supposed to rehabilitate them. We can talk about why that doesn't happen later, but that's the idea. Separate, fix, then re-engage, right? Same thing with interpersonal relationships and interpersonal violence. So if there's violence, that's a different issue. So we'll just set that aside for now, but know that I'm not just running roughshod over it. If you're committed to your spouse, you're committed to your grown adult child who's demonstrating these behaviors, then I invite people to put an eyeball toward long-term, 10 years, 20 years. If you're committed, you're committed. So we're not going to have a timeline on progress because progress is going to ebb and flow. And even though it'll look like a cryptocurrency, like a value chart where it's like spiking up and down, and we want the trend line to continue. We're not going to mark by, hey, today was a good day. What will tomorrow bring? Tomorrow might bring disaster, and so will the day after it. We don't judge on that. We judge on years at a time. And is the trend line moving up? Are you getting more compassionate? Are they getting more compassionate? Are you listening more than you talk? Are they listening more than they talk? Like, is it improving? And I do know some of these people who are in that exact situation, both personally and professionally, and almost to a fault, I can say that they do improve. However, it takes a great deal of patience. It does take a great deal of patience. And you have to be mindful that the adult who's in their 40s or 50s now didn't get there overnight. They probably had a childhood, 18 or more years of living with the conditions that brought them to that personality disorder. So it's not going to get undone overnight either. And awareness is key. That's why diagnostics are really important, actually, so we know what we're dealing with. But even absent that, if I and the husband know that the wife is struggling and the wife's just not interested in facing that, we can still work with that, because there's tips and techniques that you can deploy, things like patience, kindness, forgiveness, more and more forgiveness, more and more patience, more and more kindness.
Okay.
You know,
Okay. I'm going to push back
right?
I'm going to push back on you a little bit here.
Sure.
And people will make up their own minds about what they think about this, but I think you're too soft. You probably think I'm too hard. I guess why I say that is I don't know why. Why is it a good thing? Why is it a helpful thing to say to somebody who's in a dynamic like this with a personality disordered spouse, more patience, more love, more this, more that? And I heard you say, well, for those of you who can't get out of it, I'm going to push back on that a little bit too. Define can't.
There's never
Because a lot of times when I hear can't, I hear can't, but what it really is I'm unwilling to make that choice.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I didn't say can't, because that's not really a word that I use. It was probably something like people who chose not to. They've committed themselves to okay, we just don't get divorced in my family. Fine. I honor that. It's still a choice. And I agree with you. Can't is off the table. That we don't use the word can't. That's unless there's a physical limitation, I'm not interested in can't.
Right.
If it's dealing with psychology. So, patience and compassion and love and forgiveness don't come without boundaries, though. And some of those boundaries look like corrective information. So we'll just stick with husband-wife dynamic. Wife has the illness. Husband is the one tolerating it or enduring it. And wife comes back with some over-the-top, screechy complaint about something innocuous having to do with, dishes in the kitchen or whatever. Husband goes, I'm telling the husband, hey, have patience, know where this is coming from. Look past the outward behavior to the soul of the person on the inside. It's probably been wounded, right? Now, also, hey, I don't appreciate when you talk to me like that. That's not okay, right? And it sends the twofold message. I'm not gonna sit here and take it, and I appreciate why you're doing it. I'm not saying it's okay. It's not okay. I'm not condoning it. So those two thoughts that seemingly are opposed can live in the same space together. And that's what I'm continuing to advocate for in my very crude way on Twitter. But the idea that you can love and set limits. Now, to your point, though, how often do you set the limits and how far do you go? Well, if you've already decided in your mind that we're not getting divorced, then all you can do is repeatedly walk out of the kitchen ad infinitum.
Right.
Right. So what good is a limit if a limit doesn't mean anything? Well, that's up for debate too. And I've heard that lots of times. It's like, couples will sit in front of me. It's like, this is the last straw. It's like, no, it isn't. Because if it were, you wouldn't be here with him next to you right now. So what does it really mean? Right.
Okay, good. Thank you. I want to switch gears here a little bit, and focus on a particular situation. And I shared this with you before, but I'm going to read a portion of this letter for the audience to give them the context. Got a letter from a listener. I've given her a pseudonym. I'm going to call her Dolores, but that's not her name. And this is her situation. My husband and I struggle with a bad situation. His ex-wife, the mother of his son, is certainly a narcissist. I've spent 7 years researching to understand what the hell is wrong with this person, why she does what she does, and why her life is in the state that it's in. She ticks every box. Every article about narcissistic abuse reads like it was written for her personally. We struggle because my stepson, who came to live with my husband and me full time, is at the very least emotionally and mentally abused by his mother. He has no idea. This is his normal, and we know that he may not understand what is happening until he's older. He may never understand it. He's 13, an only child, and has only lived with us for a year. We watch the cycle of abuse in real time. A period of contempt and haughtiness followed by rage and cruel behavior, screaming, swearing, destroying property. The silent treatment, then charm and apology, and then a period of affection and uncharacteristic generosity. Then the cycle repeats. One day she tells him he's exceptional and he's idealized. Another day she tells him that she hates him, he's fat. They slept and showered together until he was 12. and someone she worked with anonymously reported her to Child Protective Services. The investigator called us as required by law and said they didn't find any evidence of abuse. This young man has been trained to keep secrets. His mother hides behind psychobabble and social causes. During the interview with the investigator, both my stepson and his mother went on at length about social issues and advocating for women, etc. Here's the nugget. We've made a commitment never to respond in kind. We say very little about her in return and try to respond with stuff like, that's too bad, that's not the right way to talk about and treat people. He sees a counselor every week. Still, you can see the deleterious impact of his mother's behavior. He's terrified of his mother's disapproval. Our fear is that he will become a narcissist himself or go right into an abusive adult relationship with a narcissist. How familiar does that sort of thing sound to you, Jake?
Very, unfortunately. And the first thing I want to say is thanks for the letter, because it takes a lot of courage to share that. Also, that's horrible, but unfortunately it's not unique. I've been working in this profession for about 13 years now, almost. And I started by cutting my teeth doing in-home work with some of the most severely impacted youth and families in our community, often in rural areas where they don't have services and have never been exposed to it. In some cases, I was the first one. This is prior to me even having my counseling degree. And what I saw was a lot of that cyclical personality disordered abuse. And it's terrible. Like, the system is capital T, capital S, that's supposed to help people, is under-resourced and underpowered as it is. So whatever contact they may have with a social worker, a CPS investigator, law enforcement, even school counselors and educators, they don't have time to delve into the deep ickiness that built up over years. And even as professionals, 1 hour a week is, I mean, what do you do with that, right? You got to be really good and really fast. So we lean on the family, and so thankfully this young man has a healthy system. It sounds like, just by the words that his stepmom now wrote. Yep. So that all being said, I personally I shared this with you before we kicked off, because that letter, I mean, it's too familiar. I shared with you that I don't have enough fingers and toes to count the exact number of people I've interacted with professionally, like myself, not counting my agency or any of my colleagues. I can't count the number of people that have exactly that same scenario. It's crazy. It's not, and it's almost a 50-50 split between dads and moms who corrupt the kids. This one happens to be a mom, but the dads will do it too.
Yeah. It can be that too. Well, yeah. You know, this person who wrote, and by the way, for the audience listening, I anonymized this, but I did also correspond with this listener, and she knows and has given permission for us to talk about this. So just wanted everyone to know this. Yeah. She asked me, you were a kid who had a mother like this, Josh. What would you have wanted the adults in your life to do to make this better? And honestly, I didn't know what to say, Jake. I think my first instinct, there were adults in my life who were normal range, and who, looking back now, I can see that they knew I lived in an abusive home, and I needed some stability from an outside adult, and they gave that to me either through just being a friend who talked to me, or somebody who went to a game with me, or a movie, things like that. Those were important, and I remember those people. And I think I want to say what I would have wanted as a kid would be for someone to acknowledge that my mother was insane and that I was not. Yeah. But I'm not sure, because I think it's also possible I might have reacted badly to that. I might have went on to defend my mother. I don't know what I would. What can we say to people like these two good people who are trying to be helpful, but they don't want to talk mom down?
I love that you shared that, by the way. I love that you shared that you may have reacted poorly to somebody pointing that out. And that's what happens when we point out people's blind spots without their permission, first of all. And secondly, in in a very non-compassionate way. Sometimes we just want to shake them and wake them up, right? It's like that scene in Airplane when they're all waiting to like slap the lady. Snap out of it. But that only begets defensiveness, and it usually ruins rapport. So what I tell people is, and I say this frequently, when there's even the mildest of disagreements between parenting philosophies in separate homes, I say, look, you commit to your style, and eventually the kid figures it out. And I know that sounds hopey, a little ethereal, but in my experience, allowing the liberty for somebody to choose, given many options, they'll choose the one that's most effective. They're not going to choose the one that's destructive. It doesn't matter how much leverage the person has. And now I'll use you as an example. It took you a few years, but you finally figured it out, and I think there's merit to that. I do hang my hat on the idea that people can change, rehabilitation can happen, and health and healing can come, right? So I would tell the parents, keep doing what you're doing, keep reminding the kid, right? Set the standard, and whatever happens elsewhere in life, you don't have control over. And that's a really tough pill for people to swallow. They want to protect their kids. They want to control them. They want to save them from all the ails of society. And you can't unless you wrap them in bubble wrap and stick them in the corner, right? So we're centering on a parental influence here, which is very, very heavy and can be really influential. But there's other influences. And we discussed this before coming on, and maybe this is the time to segue into it, about how can people from quote unquote normal homes with normal parents end up with personality disorders afterward. And I think this points to that. Like, you don't know the external influences. I'll use myself as an example. I was bullied from 3rd grade through 12th, and I don't think my parents had, they sort of knew, but I don't think they knew the depth, definitely not the pervasiveness. And that left me really, really wounded going into college. I had no sense of self. And looking back, I was a wreck. Like, I was a complete wreck. I was probably some mix of histrionic and narcissistic myself, and borderline. Like, eventually I figured it out, and I don't think I'm like that now, I hope. But man, it took a toll, and I know
that's a really good example.
Found me intolerable. People found me totally intolerable.
I like that this is so obvious to me, but it wasn't obvious to me until you were just talking about this. When we're talking about Dolores and her family here, I think the fact that Dolores and her husband, who is this boy's actual father, they both know what the deal is with mom, the ex-wife here. They know that she's cluster B. That's why the divorce happened, right? They are already doing what they need to do to give this boy, first of all, a safe and normal and sane place to be.
Correct.
When he's there on the weekends or for however long he is.
Yep.
They're already providing the normalcy that he can use as a contrast. And it reminds me of the times that I used to spend with Aunt Vivian and my cousins as a kid, the nice normal side of the family who took us on trips and did all those things with us. Just the fact that they are there and they're stable, and that, if something comes up like that, they say, that's a terrible way to talk to people. I'm sorry that happened. That consistency, and I think they're already doing what they can do to model normalcy.
Right.
And I would imagine, I mean, I can see it from what Dolores said, and I know how it feels. She can see the mental fuck-ups that are going on in this kid's head. She can see how he reacts to an episode with his mother, right. And it's painful. And she and Dad are watching him probably learn some bad lessons that he's going to have to unlearn, react well or poorly. Unfortunately, he is going to suffer. He's going to suffer from his relationship with his mother. There's no way to stop that suffering. But it sounds like what you're saying is, even if it takes time, that doesn't necessarily mean it's terminal, because he's got some other good things in his life.
Yep. Right. And it's encouraging to know that they're doing the right thing. Just keep doing it. Right. One of the things that I was told very, very early on in my career, when I was doing the in-home work before I had a degree and a license, was just be an alternative for the kids to see. Sometimes just being the only healthy person in their life outside of teachers, maybe, because none of them have coaches because they're not playing sports because they're all, neglected. Um, just being a healthy alternative is enough to show them that it's possible. And I thought that's so brilliant. Just being healthy, right? And modeling that for them. And I think that's useful to know when we're dealing with children who are going to be wounded, they're going to be damaged. That's fine. Wounds and damage heal. Those aren't permanent labels. But the other thing we considered too is kids who have to grow up too fast. There's lots of neglect that happens in ways that we don't imagine when parents are trying really, really hard and working multiple jobs, but they're just unavailable time-wise. And so the oldest kid ends up having to raise the three other siblings. That's growing up too fast. And I think one mistake we make as clinicians or interventionists broadly is we try to put the lid back on and stuff the genie back in the bottle, talking to the 13-year-old going on 30, saying, "Hey, it's okay, just be a kid." It's like that's a big mistake. They're already grown.
I heard that a lot.
Yeah, just be a kid. It's like, well, we can balance that somehow. The kid knows that they can't abandon the responsibilities mom shirked off, right? And and so we want to meet them where they are and say, "Look, you've already grown up too fast. You know it, I know it, but how can we add some joy to your life, right? Rather than unwinding things, let's continue moving forward. Let's build you responsibly. We're not going to unring the bell. And how do we coach you now?" Same thing for kids who are like exposed to say pornography or sexual content at way too early of an age. Yep. Like you can't unring that bell. So now what do we do with it? We say, well, stop looking at it. That's a great start. Don't artificialize your sexual relationships. But then let's not pretend it didn't happen. Violence is the same thing. If you see some ugly violence at school because your school is a violent place, we can't unring that bell. So we want to continue moving forward while giving the alternative. And this goes for anybody who's parenting, regardless of your philosophies, your belief systems, your politics, it doesn't matter. You tell your kids what's right and you stand on it firmly, anchor yourself. And then whatever the world wants to say to them, that's up to the world. And if they've anchored themselves well enough to you, they'll be able to withstand that temptation to go sideways, regardless of what it is. And I don't care what the politics are about it, left, right, center, religions. You teach your kids values, ethics, and safety. That's your job, right? Just keep them safe, teach them something, and give them some values, and they'll figure it out on their way. We all do.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and unexpectedly, I feel more hopeful. You helped me to look at this and Dolores, I hope you are feeling more hopeful too. I think you and your husband are doing better than you probably think you are. But that's true, Jake. We can't unring the bell. We can't go back and re-raise children who are raised a certain way, but we can add good things as they go along. That's a really good way to look at it. Remind people where they can find you. And I want to remind people also, or people who haven't heard from you before, not only you are a marriage and family therapist, but you belong to an interesting group of people who talk specifically about the issues of responsible gun ownership and mental health. And that's something very interesting to me and I think would be interesting to the audience. So where can they find you in your work on these things?
So the firearms stuff comes from an organization called Walk the Talk America, and the website is WTTA.org, Walk the Talk America. You can also spell it out, walkthetalkamerica.org.
Yep.
What's really cool about that organization is that it was founded by firearms professionals, people from the industry. The CEO, the founder, Mike Sodini, sold his portion of his family's importing company some years ago to focus solely on this. And what it is at its core is a suicide prevention organization. A couple of statistics real quick. 2/3 of all firearms deaths, give or take, it's always been over 60% for about the last decade, but it's about 64% of all firearms deaths are suicide. So if you want to move the needle on, quote unquote gun violence, you target the suicides because that's the biggest demographic. Now, also half of suicides are by firearm, the completed ones. Attempts are something different because most attempts are by poisoning. Yeah. So what we're trying to do is through non-legislative means, non-policy means, through education, training, we're trying to encourage people to store their firearms responsibly. And we're also redefining what it means to be responsible with your storage by defining it as preventing unauthorized access. That's it. So we don't want to use the word safe, because safe is very subjective, and it's kind of been watered down over the pandemic too. So we don't say safe, we say responsible, and responsible invites an accountability. And speaking of accountability, we also want to get away from the word accident. Accident is not, something from the cosmos that just intervened and you had no control. We want to say negligent. We want to invite personal accountability and responsibility. So if you have a negligent discharge with a gun, that's what it means. So somebody screwed up, right? So that's what we're doing. Yep. And how we're doing it is, you probably can't see my wristband because I got long sleeves on, but we got wristbands that say WTTA.org/love. Take a free and anonymous mental health screening today. So if you're part of the listening audience, you don't have to be a gun owner. Just go to the website, WTTA.org/love. Take a free and anonymous mental health screening. There's like 14 of them. A couple of them are in Spanish, and it spits you out a number. The surveys are powered by Mental Health America. And so, they're legit and they have fidelity. And if you don't like the number that gets spit out, maybe that means you need to go seek professional help. Sometimes you can take it and be like, oh, yeah, I'm serious. That's the point, right?
I know.
You invite people in, and especially gun owners.
So, okay, excellent. Yeah. So walkthetalkamerica.org.
And
Jake.
Yeah. So anyway, that and zephyrwellness.org, which is my agency. Find out our YouTube channel if you want to hear me talk, do whiteboard presentations, that kind of thing.
Excellent.
Jake Wiskerchen on Twitter.
Jake, thank you again for the time and for the expertise, and actually personally, thank you for actually giving me some hope about this stuff. I don't get it very much, but
out of your mouth, Joshua.
What'd you say?
I said, spit that black pill out of your mouth.
I know.
That's an inside joke for the listening audience, but
yeah, not so inside anymore. Jake, thank you very much. Merry Christmas, my friend.
Merry Christmas, Josh. Good to see you. And thanks for having me on. Thanks for doing what you do. It takes a hell of a lot of courage and guts.
Cool. We'll talk again. Come back after the break. For more conversation on the dark and disordered psychology that shapes today's cultural and political left, subscribe to our weekly audio podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and virtually anywhere else you get your podcasts. Let's learn to recognize these dynamics and call them what they are. Subscribe to Disaffected to learn how to break the spell.
We now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us, and thank you.
Welcome back. Now it's time for COVID Bloodlust of the Week, and we've got a couple for you. Well, a couple out of how many hundreds I see every week. We're almost 2 years into this, and people are, I was going to say still going crazy, but they're actually, some of them are going crazier than they were in the beginning. Saw this headline in the UK's paper, The Sun. Here's the tweet from the author promoting this piece. And she says, "We can't force people to have jabs, but we can force vaccine refuseniks to live a far more difficult, inconvenient, and restricted life. One that will also be more expensive because of mandatory testing." Now, let's take a look at the author. Her name is Lady Karen Brady. Let's look at Lady Brady. You're so surprised, aren't you? Doesn't look anything like you expected, did it? She's in the House of Lords in the UK. She's very posh. And you can see from her picture that she thinks very, very highly of herself. So here's what she had to say. Like many of you, it was with a heavy heart and a strong sense of deja vu that I watched the Prime Minister announce our move to new COVID rules. Having already canceled West Ham United's much-deserved and well-planned Christmas party, I found myself wondering what other lovely festive events and plans are at risk of being shelved if restrictions get ramped up further like they did last year. You know, why do I get the feeling that every time she sees some possible restrictions, her heart gets 2 sizes larger? I don't know. I must just be mean. She goes on. The Omicron variant is clearly riding roughshod through the country, but the big difference compared to this time last year is that the first dose of vaccine had only been given on December 8th and had yet to roll out. So the only weapon in our arsenal then was to stay at home and try to dodge the virus. This year, though, a good majority of us are double or even triple vaxxed. Since I followed all the rules, I never had COVID, so I do not have antibodies acquired that way, but I do have them from being double vaccinated, and I also had my booster. I really feel I have little to worry about when it comes to facing this virus. Lady Brady, how is Omicron riding roughshod across the UK when it hasn't killed a single person? More from Lady Brady. If only everyone shared my approach. But as an estimated 5 million people in the UK remain unvaccinated, despite the fact our lives, the economy, and the mental health and well-being of a nation of children were in jeopardy as a result of several brutal lockdowns last year, some people still seem to prefer not to get the vaccine. Why do you care, madam? You just said in the last paragraph that you have nothing to worry about because not only are you double vaxxed, but you had the booster. So why are you worried about this? What might you want instead? It would be fine if it just affected them, but it doesn't. In recent weeks, some 39% of COVID patients in hospital have not been vaccinated, a number that rises significantly within intensive care units. 39%? So what's the other 61%? Might they be the vaccinated? Lady Brady? Did you think for 1 second before you started banging on the keyboard? I have lost count of the number of stories involving people who refused to get vaccinated, then were in hospital with COVID, and whose dying words were, "I wished I'd got the vaccine." No, you haven't. You've lost count because you're making it up. You haven't heard a single person say that, madam. Not one. You've seen the media claim it, you've seen them repeat it, but you haven't heard a single person say that. It's about wanting to deprive other people. You can see it. This is why she bounces back and forth. She's trying to find a plausible justification for what are basically misanthropic sentiments. So, for example, but even when it's not fatal, any unvaccinated COVID patient in a hospital is taking up a bed that they would not have needed had they been vaccinated. That doesn't even make any sense. What about all the vaccinated patients who are in there? But it's only the unvaccinated people who are taking up a bed that they wouldn't have needed. But you just said that only 39% of the people hospitalized in COVID, in hospital for COVID right now were vaccinated. That leaves 61% are unvaccinated. That leaves 61% who are vaccinated. This doesn't make any sense. And, you know, you also have to ask, what is this taking up a bed? What are those beds for? How did we get to the point in the UK, for example, but it's the same in the United States. Here I go with my misshapen ear again. Pardon me, folks. But in the UK, is the NHS there to serve people, or are people there to serve the NHS? Because we're all talking as if actually using the services of the NHS is a taking, it's a theft by British citizens. The NHS is for the people, not the other way around. So here's what she wants. We have the rest of it here. My view is that we can't force people to have jabs, but we can force vaccine refuseniks to live a far more difficult, inconvenient, and restricted life, one that will also be more expensive because of mandatory testing. I was in Italy for the Monza Grand Prix in September. Oh my God, of course she was. It is impossible to be served in any cafe, restaurant, or bar, or even enter some shops without first proving you've been double vaccinated. It's a fuss-free process that takes only seconds, and we should do the same here. And what's the big deal with wearing a mask on public transports and in a shop? Here's the best part of the whole story. This is what it all comes down to. Quote, refusing to have the vaccine unless you have a medical reason to avoid it should be as socially unacceptable as smoking. And MPs have a part to play in that. They should be spelling out it is selfish not to have one and highlighting the fact that unvaccinated people are putting the health service at risk. I said this on Unsafe Space. I was on their show on Friday. You should check it out. You should always check out their show, Unsafe Space. The unvaccinated are the new smokers. And I say to those of you who might have approved of all of the anti-smoking measures, many of which were actually anti-smoker measures. They went farther than they needed to. You're smokers now too, unvaccinated people. Welcome to it. You are now the part of the dirty class, like I used to be when I was a smoker, for whom it is socially acceptable to denigrate them in public and to deprive them of the same benefits that other people have. That's all this is. You're a smoker now. Congratulations. It's not, of course, only members of the peerage in Britain. It's our second earpiece fiddling. I should have asked Santa for something new for Christmas. We've got our own royalty in America, like commentator David Frum, former George W. Bush speechwriter, now Atlantic columnist. The Atlantic is interesting. They publish a lot of absolute hysterical nonsense, but they also publish some sane stuff. So I guess I should give them credit for balance. Here's what David Frum had to say this week about the unvaccinated. Here's a tweet. But the malignant minority is not yielding to reason anytime soon. And even such seemingly basic mandates as no jab, no fly seem beyond the enforcement capability of the U.S. federal government. So what now? Oh, that's basic, is it? Have a medical procedure, have an injection, or you don't get to fly on a commercial airliner. That's not basic, my friend. That's radical and extreme. The malignant minority. Notice the reversal. It's not the unvaccinated who are malignant. It's you, David Frum. You want to hear how malignant? This is what he followed it up with. Seems the best option is 1, keep encouraging vaccines and boosters. 2, impose vaccine mandates where it can be done. 3, otherwise return to normal as fully as we can, especially the schools. And 4, let hospitals quietly triage emergency care to serve the unvaccinated last. I want to point this out to you. The evil redefinition of words. Did you catch that? Did you see which word he redefined? It was the word triage. He said, let hospitals quietly triage emergency care to serve the unvaccinated last. That's not triage. This is triage. Here's the definition from Merriam-Webster. The sorting of and allocation of treatment to patients and especially battle and disaster victims according to a system of priorities designed to maximize the number of survivors. Secondary definition. The sorting of patients as in an emergency room according to the urgency of the need for their care. So, need for care and maximizing the number of survivors. We all know that that's what triage means. It does not mean to allow hospitals to neglect the medical care of people they find distasteful. That is monstrous, David Frum. And it's a lie. He is trying to, they're all doing this. Don't let them do this. Remark on it. Remark on it in public when they change definitions. This This is a narcissistic, abusive power move. They've done the same thing with the definition of anti-vaxxer, and they've been successful because they got Merriam-Webster to change the definition of anti-vaxxer a couple of months ago. Here's what it says now. Definition of anti-vaxxer, a person who opposes the use of vaccines or regulations mandating vaccination. That second clause, a person who opposes regulations mandating vaccination, that was never part of the definition of a so-called anti-vaxxer. I don't like the term anymore. It's way too broad and it's a pejorative, but what it means is people who are opposed to vaccination. It does... They've redefined this, and I watched it happen. I've seen the before and after. This happened in this year, 2021. They've done this to normalize the idea that even people who like even people like me, I've had every recommended vaccination except the COVID shot because I'm convinced that they are a benefit to me and that they work. I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong, I'll change my mind in the future. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm against this vaccine, but I'm also against vaccine mandates for COVID. And now I'm actually against vaccine mandates in most other cases as well. Yes, I am against them in public schools now, if you are curious. Absolutely. But this is to make people like me unable to speak and be taken seriously as reasonable people. That's what that is. The Atlantic this week did have some sanity in it, which is why I need to give them credit. They ran an article from a man named Matthew Walter. I was going to say Walter Matthew. Matthew Walter, these people who have the same first... Never mind. You can figure it out. Mr. Walter is the editor of the Catholic journal Lamp, and he's also a contributing editor at the American Conservative. So he says, in November, my wife asked me whether I had seen an article with the remarkable headline, Is it safe to go to Thanksgiving dinner? Is that from last year? I asked. No, it's a few days old, she said, her voice sinking to a growling murmur. These people. I am old enough to remember the good old days when holiday advice pieces were all variations on how to talk to your Tea Party uncle about Obamacare. As Christmas approaches, we can look forward to more of this sort of thing with the meta-ethical speculation advanced to an impossibly baroque state of development. Is it okay for our 2-year-old son to hug grandma at a Christmas party if she received her booster only a few days ago? Should the toddler wear a mask except when he is slopping mashed potatoes all over his booster seat? He goes on. He talked about the fact that where he lives in the Midwest, his family and his community have lived a normal life for these past 2 years. They have never been into the masks. They haven't stopped going to parties. They haven't stopped going to school. And he talks about the contrast between people continuing to live normal lives where he is and the people, especially on the East Coast in the blue cities. And it is quite a contrast. Quote, I don't know how to put this in a way that will not make me sound flippant. No one cares. He means about COVID. Literally speaking, I know this isn't true because if it were, the articles wouldn't be commissioned. But outside the world, inhabited by the professional and managerial classes in a handful of major metropolitan areas, many, if not most, Americans are leading their lives as if COVID is over, and they have been for a long while. Yes, they have. And I hope to see more and more people doing it because you know what? We're not in a pandemic. And I don't think we've ever been in a pandemic this whole time. The virus is real. Virus does kill some people. Thankfully, yes, thankfully, not children, not young people. No, I don't want all you old folks dead. When I'm 75, I'm going to want to stay alive too. I getcha. But it is thankful that it doesn't kill children, that it's more likely to kill people once they're around the age of 80. That is a good thing. Doesn't mean I want you dead. And this is going to be our last show before Christmas. So for those of you who, like me, may have put off Christmas shopping, I have a recommendation for you. Saw it on Amazon. Somebody challenged me. They said nobody could possibly be selling these. Well, they are. I give you Kitty carpet. Kitty carpet reusable downstairs toupee merkin wig. Funny gag gift for women in Christmas tree hugger green. If you don't know what a merkin is, it's a pubic wig. And I don't know if anybody ever seriously wore them. But they've been around for a long time, and now they come in well, it doesn't say, but it looks scratch and sniff, doesn't it? Fresh pine scent. Folks, it's been almost a year that we've been doing this show. It's the holidays, and I want to say thank you to you. We started this up in January of this year, not knowing what it would turn into, and it's been almost a whole year now. And so many of you watch this show or listen to it every week. I see you hanging out in the chat. I get emails from you. I see you on my social media. It's wonderful. I've gotten to know many of you. I've gotten to know some of your stories. And so many of you have told me that the things we talk about on this show make sense to you. They help you make sense of your life, your childhood, the place you find yourself living in now. Thank you for telling me that, because that's what I want to do. And I'm glad that it's doing that. And I especially want to say thank you to all of you who have been generous. You donate to this show. You give money to this show to help us pay our bills. Thank you. You don't have to do that. You can just watch or listen, but you dig into your pocket and you care, and you help us pay for internet hosting. You help us pay for studio space. It's an honor, and we couldn't do it without you. So I feel very fortunate this Christmas. And I want to say to all of you, whether you're traveling to family or staying home, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful time. Merry Christmas, and I'll see you after the holidays.